The stars burned red with enemy fire as Commander Yara Okonkwo stood on the bridge of the U.S. Defiance, watching her fleet die around her one ship at a time. She had served in the Earth Defense Force for 23 years, and she had never seen anything like this massacre that was happening before her eyes, right now in the darkness of space above humanity's home world. The tactical display showed hundreds of red dots surrounding the blue dots that represented human ships. And those blue dots were disappearing faster than she could count them as the enemy weapons tore through metal and flesh without mercy or hesitation. "Commander, we have lost the Resolute and the Brave Heart," her first officer, Lieutenant Chun, reported, his voice shaking as he read the incoming damage reports that kept flooding their screens every few seconds. Yara gripped the railing in front of her so hard that her knuckles turned white, and she forced herself to keep watching because a commander never looks away from the death of those who served under her command. The galactic hegemony had come to end humanity forever, and they had brought enough firepower to burn every human world into ash and glass. 12 alien species had joined together 30 years ago with one simple goal in their minds. And that goal was the complete destruction of every man, woman, and child that carried human blood in their veins. They called it the Great Cleansing, and they believed they were doing the galaxy a favor by removing what they saw as a dangerous and unpredictable species from existence. The hegemony's High Tribunal had declared humanity a Category 0 threat, which meant that humans were too dangerous to enslave, too stubborn to control, and too clever to leave alive. Yara remembered the day when the first hegemony ships had appeared above Earth's colonies in the outer systems, and how the human governments had tried to negotiate and find peace with these strange visitors from distant stars. But there was no negotiation with those who saw you as nothing more than a disease to be cured. The first human colony to fall was New Horizon on the edge of the solar system, and the hegemony had killed every single person there without even giving them a chance to surrender or flee. 300,000 people had died in a single day, and that was just the beginning of the horror that would follow for the next 30 years of war. "Commander, Admiral Chun Wei is transmitting on all channels," Lieutenant Chun said, and his face had gone pale because everyone knew what this message would contain. The main screen flickered and showed the tired face of Admiral Chun Wei, the supreme commander of all human forces, sitting in his command chair on the flagship that was burning and breaking apart around him. His uniform was covered in blood and dust, and Yara could see the flames reflecting in his eyes as he spoke what would be his final words to the human race. "To all human forces and all human worlds, this is Admiral Chun Wei with my final transmission," the old man said, and his voice was calm even though death was only moments away for him. "The Battle of Sol Perimeter has failed, and our fleet is destroyed beyond any hope of recovery or repair. We have lost this war, my friends and fellow humans. May whatever gods exist forgive us for failing our children and their children who will never be born." The transmission ended with static as the Admiral's flagship exploded in a brilliant flash of light that Yara could see through the bridge windows. She closed her eyes for just a moment to honor the man who had led humanity's defense for 15 years, and then she opened them again because there was still work to do. "How many ships do we have left?" she asked, already knowing the answer would break her heart. 17 combat-ready vessels out of the original 412. Lieutenant Chun answered, and his voice cracked on the numbers that represented so much death and loss. Down on Earth, 17 billion people were looking up at the sky and watching the flashes of light. That meant their protectors were dying for them. On Mars, 3 billion more waited in underground shelters, holding their children close and praying to gods they had almost forgotten. The orbital stations around both planets held another 2 billion souls, all of them trapped with nowhere to run and no way to escape what was coming for them. Yara looked at the enemy fleet on her display, counting over 2,000 warships that were now moving toward Earth with the slow and terrible patience of predators who knew their prey had nowhere left to hide. "What are your orders, Commander?" Lieutenant Chun asked, and every officer on the bridge turned to look at her with eyes full of fear and desperate hope. She wanted to tell them that everything would be okay, that she had a plan to save them all, but she was done lying to good people who deserved the truth. "We fight until we cannot fight anymore," she said, and her voice was steady, even though her heart was breaking inside her chest. "We make them pay for every inch of space they take from us. We show them that humans do not surrender, do not beg, and do not go quietly into the dark." The bridge crew straightened their backs and returned to their stations, with new determination in their eyes, ready to die standing rather than live kneeling. But even as Yara prepared to give her final battle orders, something was happening deep beneath the surface of Earth that would change everything. In the Himalayan mountains, buried under 3 miles of rock and protected by doors that could survive a nuclear blast, there was a facility that officially did not exist on any map or record. Dr. Ilyas Marketti stood in the center of this secret place, surrounded by artifacts that humanity had discovered on a dead world at the far edge of the galaxy 50 years ago. He was 73 years old, with white hair and hands that shook from too many years of work and too little sleep, but his mind was sharper than ever. For 4 decades, he and his team had studied these strange objects that seemed to be made of materials that should not exist according to everything science knew about the universe. The symbols carved into their surfaces had resisted every attempt to decode them, mocking the greatest minds humanity had produced with their silent mystery. But tonight, as the sky above burned with the death of human ships, Ilyas had finally cracked the code that would unlock secrets older than the stars themselves. He stared at the translation on his screen, reading it again and again because he could not believe what the ancient words were telling him. "This is not a warning," he whispered to himself, feeling tears running down his wrinkled cheeks. "This is an invitation. The artifacts were not left behind by accident or forgotten by their creators who had vanished so long ago. They were a key, designed to be found by a species that would not exist for another 3 billion years after the key was made. They were designed for humans and humans alone." Ilyas picked up his communication device with trembling hands and called the emergency line that connected directly to the World Council bunker. "This is Dr. Marchetti from Project Ancient Light," he said, his voice shaking with a mixture of terror and hope that he had never felt before in his entire life. "I need to speak with the Council immediately. Tell them I know how to save humanity." The World Council bunker was buried deep beneath the Swiss Alps, protected by enough armor and shields to survive the end of the world itself. 12 leaders sat around a long table made of dark wood, their faces lit by the glow of holographic displays showing the destruction happening above their heads in the cold vacuum of space. President Amara Diallo of the United Earth Government sat at the head of the table, her silver hair tied back and her dark eyes heavy with the weight of 22 billion lives resting on her shoulders. General Alexei Volkov sat to her right, his scarred face showing no emotion even as reports of defeat after defeat scrolled across his personal display. Councillor Fatima al-Rashid represented the civilian population, and she had been crying before the meeting started because her grandson served on one of the ships that had just been destroyed. The other council members included military commanders, scientific advisors, and representatives from every major human settlement that still survived. They had been arguing for 3 hours about what to do, and none of them had any good answers to give. "We could try to negotiate a surrender," one counselor suggested weakly, knowing even as he spoke that the idea was hopeless. "The hegemony does not accept surrenders from Category 0 species," General Volkov replied, his Russian accent thick with anger and frustration. "They will kill us all whether we fight or not. So we might as well fight, President," Diallo was about to speak when the doors to the chamber burst open and Dr. Ilias Marchetti walked in, escorted by two confused guards who had been ordered to bring him immediately. The old scientist looked like he had not slept in days, with wild eyes and papers clutched in his shaking hands. "I apologize for the interruption," he said, though his voice made it clear he was not sorry at all. "But what I have to tell you cannot wait another minute." President Diallo raised her hand to stop the guards from removing him, because she recognized Marchetti from the classified briefing she had received about Project Ancient Light. "Dr. Marchetti, your facility was supposed to be studying alien artifacts," she said carefully. "What could you possibly have discovered that matters right now?" Elias walked to the center of the room and placed his papers on the table, spreading them out so everyone could see the strange symbols and his translations. 50 years ago, our first deep space expedition found the ruins of a civilization on a dead world at the edge of the galaxy. He began. "The species that built those ruins called themselves the progenitors, and they disappeared 3 billion years before any other known species in the galaxy even existed." General Volkov leaned forward with interest, because he had always wondered what the secret facility in the mountains was really doing. "We have been studying their artifacts for decades, trying to understand their technology and their language," Elias continued. "Tonight, I finally decoded their primary message." He took a deep breath and looked around the room at the most powerful humans left alive. "The progenitors did not die," he said, and his words fell into the silence like stones into still water. "They evolved beyond physical form and moved into a dimension outside normal space and time. They became something greater than flesh and blood. They became what ancient humans might have called gods." Counselor Al-Rashid shook her head in disbelief, thinking that the old scientist had finally lost his mind. "Even if this is true, what does it matter to us now?" she asked. "How does knowing about some ancient species help us survive the next 24 hours? Elias smiled, and there was something wild and desperate in that smile. "Because they left behind a way to contact them," he answered. "The artifacts are not just relics or monuments. They are a key, a summoning device designed to call the progenitors back from wherever they went." The room erupted in chaos as everyone tried to speak at once. General Volkov demanded to know if this was some kind of joke. Counselor Al-Rashid called it dangerous superstition. Other council members argued about whether to believe any of it. President Diallo slammed her hand on the table, and everyone fell silent. "Let him finish," she commanded, and her voice left no room for argument. Elias nodded his thanks and continued his explanation. "The most remarkable thing about the artifacts is that they were designed specifically for humans," he said. "The activation sequence is encoded into human DNA. Only a human can turn the key and open the door. The progenitors somehow knew that we would arise 3 billion years after they left, and they designed their summoning system to work only for us." General Volkov stared at the old scientist with an expression that mixed hope and suspicion. "Why would beings that powerful care about us?" he asked. "Why would they choose humans out of all the species in the galaxy?" "I do not know," Elias admitted honestly. "But the inscriptions call us their inheritors. They call us their children. They say they have been waiting for us to find them and call them home." The council members looked at each other, and Yara could see the same question in all their eyes. Should they trust the words of beings they had never met, written 3 billion years ago for a species that did not yet exist? Counselor Al-Rashid spoke the fear that everyone was feeling. "What if they are not benevolent?" she asked. "What if they are worse than the hegemony? What if calling them destroys us faster than our enemies would? We know nothing about their intentions. We would be gambling the survival of our entire species on hope and ancient symbols." Elias did not argue with her concerns, because they were valid and reasonable. "You are right that we know almost nothing about them," he agreed. But I can tell you what we do know. The progenitors seeded life across thousands of worlds before they left. Many of the species in the hegemony exist because the progenitors created the conditions for them to evolve. They were gardeners, cultivators of life throughout the galaxy. Does that sound like the behavior of monsters? General Volkov stood up and walked to the window that showed a simulation of the battle happening above Earth. "We have 17 ships against 2,000, he said quietly. "Our planetary defenses will hold for maybe 3 days. After that, the hegemony will begin their orbital bombardment. Every city on Earth will be reduced to ash. Everyone we have ever loved will die screaming." He turned back to face the council with fire in his eyes. "I would rather take a chance on ancient gods than accept certain death," he declared. "At least this way we might survive. At least this way we fight with something more than broken ships and dying hope." President Diallo listened to the arguments continue for another hour, weighing every word and every concern. She thought about her daughter who lived in Tokyo with her 2 grandchildren. She thought about the billions of humans who were counting on her to make the right decision. She thought about what it meant to be human, to be the species that always reached for the impossible, even when everyone said it could not be done. Finally, she raised her hand and the room fell silent once more. "We will activate the artifacts," she announced. "Dr. Marchetti, begin preparations immediately. General Volkov, hold the line as long as you can, and may whatever gods exist, old or new, have mercy on us all." Elias bowed his head in acknowledgement and hurried from the room to begin the most important work of his entire life. The fate of humanity now rested on symbols carved 3 billion years ago by beings who had dreamed of this moment before humans even existed. And somewhere, in a dimension beyond space and time, something ancient stirred in its endless sleep and began to wake. Commander Yara Okonkwo had been fighting for 18 hours straight. When the message came through on a secure channel that only the highest-ranking officers could access, her ship, the Defiance, had somehow survived the first waves of the hegemony assault, though it was bleeding atmosphere from a dozen hull breaches and had lost half its weapons. She was covered in sweat and blood, some of it her own from a cut above her eye, and her hands ached from gripping the command console through every violent maneuver. "Commander, you have a priority transmission from Earth Command," Lieutenant Chen reported, his voice rough from exhaustion and grief. "They are ordering you to return to Earth immediately. They say you have been chosen for a special mission." Yara wanted to laugh at the absurdity of leaving her crew in the middle of a battle, but something in Chun's tone told her this was not a joke. "What kind of mission?" she asked, already knowing she would obey whatever order came from command. "They did not say," Chun replied. "They only said that the fate of humanity depends on you specifically." 6 hours later, Yara stood in the chamber of First Light, deep beneath the Himalayan mountains, staring at something that made her forget how to breathe. The artifacts that Dr. Marchetti had spent his life studying had been assembled into a towering structure that reached toward the ceiling like a crystalline tree made of light and shadow. Each piece connected to the others in ways that seemed impossible, creating patterns that hurt her eyes when she tried to follow them. The air in the chamber felt thick and heavy, charged with energy that made the hair on her arms stand up and her heart beat faster. "Why me?" Yara asked, turning to face Dr. Marchetti and President Diallo, who had come to witness this historic moment. "The artifacts require a human mind to serve as a bridge between our world and the dimension where the progenitors exist," Elias explained. "But not just any human mind. The connection requires someone with specific qualities, someone who has faced death and did not break, someone who carries the weight of others' lives and did not collapse, someone whose mind can hold together when exposed to concepts that would shatter most people." President Diallo stepped forward and placed her hand on Yara's shoulder. We scanned the psychological profiles of every human we could reach, she said softly. Your mind is uniquely suited for this task. You have survived things that would have destroyed anyone else. The progenitors designed this for someone exactly like you. Yara looked at the crystalline structure and felt fear crawling up her spine like cold fingers. What will happen to me? She asked. Will I survive this? Elias hesitated before answering, and that hesitation told Yara everything she needed to know. I do not know, he admitted. The inscription suggests that the bridge mind will be transformed by the experience. You might die. You might live but be changed forever. Or you might emerge stronger than you ever imagined. We simply do not know because no one has ever done this before. Yara closed her eyes and thought about her crew still fighting and dying above Earth. She thought about the children in the shelters waiting for someone to save them. She thought about what it meant to be a soldier, to put yourself between danger and innocent people. I will do it, she said, and her voice did not shake even though she was terrified. Tell me what I need to do. Elias guided her to the center of the chamber, where a single pillar of crystal rose from the floor. Its surface covered in symbols that seemed to move and shift when she was not looking directly at them. Place your hands on the pillar and open your mind, he instructed. Do not fight what happens next. Let the connection form naturally, and whatever you see, whatever you feel, remember who you are. Yara took a deep breath and placed her palms flat against the crystal, feeling its surface warm beneath her touch like living skin. For a moment, nothing happened, and she wondered if the whole thing was just a desperate fantasy created by a dying species. Then the universe exploded inside her head. She saw stars being born in clouds of fire and gas, watching time speed forward as entire galaxies formed and grew and died around her. She witnessed the rise of the progenitors, beings of flesh that slowly transformed themselves into creatures of pure thought and light over millions of years. She felt their joy as they seeded life across the cosmos, creating the conditions for countless species to evolve and grow and reach toward the stars. She experienced their sadness when they realized they had grown too powerful to remain in the physical universe, without destroying it with their very presence. She understood their decision to transcend, to move beyond matter and energy into a realm where they could exist without harming the fragile life they had created. And she felt their hope, their desperate, beautiful hope, that someday one of their children would find the key and call them home. We have waited so long, voices whispered in her mind, countless and ancient and filled with love. We have watched you struggle and fight and grow. We have seen your wars and your kindness, your cruelty and your courage. We have loved you from afar, unable to touch you, unable to help you, until now, until you called, until you proved you were ready. Yara felt tears streaming down her face in the physical world, but in this place of light, and thought she was laughing with joy. Please, she begged, putting all her grief and hope and desperation into that single word. Please help us. We are dying. Our children are dying. We have tried everything, and we have failed. You are our last hope. The ancient minds wrapped around her like warm arms, holding her together when she felt like she might fly apart into a million pieces. Show us, they said. Show us these enemies who hunt our inheritors. Show us why you weep. Yara opened her memories to them, letting them see 30 years of war and death and loss. She showed them the burning colonies and the murdered families. She showed them the arrogance of the hegemony and their cold declaration that humans must be erased from existence. She showed them humanity's desperate fight against impossible odds, never surrendering, never giving up, even when all hope seemed lost. The progenitors watched, and for the first time in 3 billion years, they felt something they had almost forgotten. They felt anger. The sky above Earth tore open like a curtain being pulled aside by giant hands. Every human on the planet felt it, a presence so vast and ancient that it made the mountains seem young and the oceans seem shallow. The hegemony fleet stopped its advance as sensors screamed warnings that made no sense. And then a voice spoke, resonating through every mind in the solar system, alien and human alike. "You have called. We have heard. Show us these enemies who hunt our inheritors." High Admiral Kethvarin of the hegemony looked out at the impossible shapes descending from the tier in space and felt his foreheart stop beating for a moment. Gods had returned to the universe, and they were very, very angry. High Admiral Kethvarin had served the Galactic hegemony for 200 years, climbing through the ranks by being smarter and more ruthless than everyone around him. His species, the Vethkai, were among the most feared warriors in the galaxy, with armored skin that could stop most projectiles and forearms that could tear apart any enemy who got too close. He had personally overseen the extermination of 3 species that the hegemony had deemed too dangerous to exist, and he had never felt even a moment of doubt or regret. Humans were supposed to be his 4th victory, his greatest triumph, the achievement that would secure his name in hegemony history forever. But now, as he stood on the bridge of his flagship and watched impossible shapes descend from the tier in space, he felt something he had not experienced since he was a child. He felt terror. "What are those things?" his second officer demanded, her voice rising toward panic as the sensors displayed readings that violated every known law of physics. "I do not know," Kethvarin admitted, and the words tasted like ash in his mouth. The beings that emerged from the tier were vast beyond comprehension, geometric forms of light and shadow that seemed to exist in more dimensions than the eye could perceive. They moved without engines or thrusters, gliding through space as if gravity and inertia were mere suggestions that they chose to ignore. Their smallest members were larger than his flagship, and their largest were the size of small moons. "All ships, open fire!" Kethvarin commanded, because he was a warrior and warriors fought even when they knew they could not win. 2,000 hegemony warships unleashed everything they had, filling the void between the fleets with enough firepower to crack planets and boil oceans. The weapons struck the ancient beings and simply vanished, absorbed into their impossible forms like rain into an endless sea. The progenitors did not even slow down. "Retreat," Kethvarin ordered, abandoning his pride for the sake of survival. "All ships, full retreat to the rally point." But it was already too late. The Ancient Ones reached out with power that predated the stars themselves, and they began to reshape reality around the hegemony fleet. Ships that had been charging their jump drives suddenly found their reactors replaced with blocks of inert matter, dead and cold and useless. Weapon systems rewrote themselves into harmless sculptures of metal and crystal. Soldiers forgot how to breathe, then remembered again a moment later, gasping and terrified. And the admirals, the commanders, the leaders who had ordered the deaths of billions, experienced something far worse. They felt every death they had ever caused, simultaneously, their minds flooded with the final moments of every victim who had died by their orders. Kethvarin collapsed to his knees as the weight of 3 entire species worth of suffering crashed through his consciousness like a tidal wave. He felt children burning in orbital bombardments. He felt mothers dying while protecting their young. He felt fathers fighting with bare hands against soldiers in powered armor. He felt old people choking on poison gas and young people crushed beneath falling buildings. Every scream, every sob, every desperate prayer became part of him, and he understood for the first time what he had truly done. "Please," he whimpered, and he did not even know who he was begging. "Please make it stop." The progenitors heard his plea and considered it with minds that had pondered the nature of existence for 3 billion years. "You cry for mercy," they observed, their voice resonating through his skull. "Did you give mercy to those you destroyed? Did you listen when they begged you to stop? Did you care when their children asked what they had done to deserve death? Cathorn could not answer, because there was no answer that would not condemn him further. Throughout the hegemony fleet, the same scene played out thousands of times. Officers who had committed atrocities wept as they finally understood the true cost of their actions. Soldiers who had followed orders without question found themselves questioning everything they had ever believed. The hegemony's iron discipline shattered like glass as its members confronted the reality of what they had become. But the progenitors were not finished. They reached into the minds of every being in the hegemony fleet and showed them something else, something that made the horror of their crimes seem small by comparison. They showed them the truth that the progenitors themselves had created the conditions for every hegemony species to evolve. The truth that the hegemony's ancestors had been uplifted and guided by beings they had completely forgotten. The truth that the species they had condemned as dangerous and inferior were their own brothers and sisters, seeded from the same cosmic garden. "You have forgotten who you are," the progenitors declared. "You were meant to be caretakers, gardeners, shepherds of the young species who came after you. Instead, you became tyrants and murderers. You betrayed everything your ancestors promised to become. You betrayed us." Cathorn looked up at the impossible beings that filled his view screen and saw something he had never expected to see. He saw sorrow. These ancient gods, these beings of infinite power, were not angry anymore. They were sad. They were disappointed in children who had lost their way. "What do you want from us?" Cathorn asked, his voice small and broken. "What can we possibly do to make this right?" The progenitors considered the question for a long moment, and when they spoke again, their voice was gentler than before. "That is not for us to decide," they said. "Ask the humans. They are the ones you tried to destroy. Their forgiveness is what matters now, not ours." On Earth, Commander Yara Okonkwo still stood with her hands on the crystal pillar. Her consciousness stretched between two worlds. She had felt everything the progenitors had done, experienced their judgment and their sorrow through the link they shared. "What would you have us do with them?" the ancient minds asked her. "We could end them all with a thought. We could scatter their atoms across the void. We could make them suffer for centuries before we finally let them die. You have the right to ask for any of these things. You have the right to vengeance." Yara thought about all the humans who had died in 30 years of war. She thought about the colonies burned and the families murdered. She thought about the fear and the grief and the endless fighting. And then she thought about what kind of species she wanted humanity to become. "No," she said, and her voice was tired but firm. "We will not start our new existence with genocide, even against those who tried to commit genocide against us. Let them live. Let them remember what they have done and live with that knowledge. Let them have the chance to become something better than what they were. That is the human way." The progenitors felt surprise ripple through their ancient minds, followed by something that felt very much like pride. "You are wiser than we hoped," they said. "You are more than we dreamed you could be. Perhaps we chose our inheritors better than we knew." They withdrew their power from the hegemony fleet, leaving thousands of ships drifting helplessly in space with crews who could barely remember how to stand. The war that had raged for 30 years ended not with a final battle, but with a moment of mercy that would echo through the galaxy forever. And somewhere in the distance, the universe itself seemed to let out a breath it had been holding for 3 billion years. 1 year had passed since the day the Ancient Ones returned to the universe, and everything had changed in ways that no one could have imagined. The Galactic Hegemony no longer existed as a unified force of conquest and destruction. Its member species had scattered back to their home worlds, each one struggling to rebuild their identity after learning the terrible truth about their own history. Some had fallen into chaos as old governments collapsed under the weight of shame and guilt. Others had begun the slow, painful process of transformation, trying to become worthy of the legacy they had betrayed. 3 species had already sent ambassadors to Earth, begging for the chance to make amends for the crimes committed in their names. They brought gifts and knowledge and resources, offering everything they had in exchange for the forgiveness they knew they did not deserve. Humanity had accepted their offerings and their apologies, not because the wounds of 30 years had healed, but because holding on to hatred would only poison the future they were trying to build. Commander Yara Akanko, who had once been a simple soldier fighting a losing war, now held a title she had never expected or wanted: Earth's first ambassador to the galaxy. She stood on the observation deck of Concordance Prime, a massive station built in neutral space where representatives from dozens of species had gathered for the first true peace conference in galactic history. The stars stretched out before her like scattered diamonds, and she thought about how close humanity had come to never seeing them again. "You look tired," a familiar voice said from behind her. She turned to find Dr. Elias Marchetti walking toward her with 2 cups of coffee, his white hair neatly combed and his old eyes sparkling with energy that seemed impossible for a man of his age. "I am tired," Yara admitted, accepting one of the cups gratefully. "Turns out being an ambassador is harder than fighting battles. At least in battles you know who your enemies are." Elias laughed and joined her at the window, looking out at the same stars that had fascinated him since he was a child. "The progenitors left something for you," he said casually, reaching into his pocket and pulling out a small crystal that glowed with inner light. "They said you would know what to do with it when the time was right." Yara took the crystal and felt warmth spread through her fingers, followed by whispers of ancient voices at the edge of her consciousness. Since the day she had served as the bridge between worlds, she had retained a faint connection to the ancient ones, like an echo of the bond they had shared. They had returned to their dimension beyond space and time, but they had not abandoned humanity completely. They watched from their distant realm, proud parents observing their children take their first steps into a wider universe. "What does it do?" she asked, turning the crystal over in her hand. "It contains the locations of 17 other worlds where the progenitors seeded life," Elias explained. 17 other species like us, scattered across the galaxy, most of them still primitive and unaware of the vast universe around them. The progenitors want us to find them, to guide them, to be for them what the progenitors could not be for us. Yara felt the weight of that responsibility settle onto her shoulders, heavier than anything she had ever carried before. "Why us?" she asked, the same question she had asked when they first chose her to activate the artifacts. "Why do they trust humans with something so important?" "Because you showed them who you are," Elias answered simply. "When you had the chance for vengeance, you chose mercy. When you could have asked the progenitors to fight your battles forever, you asked them to teach you instead. When the galaxy expected you to become conquerors, you chose to become builders. That is why they trust you. That is why they believe humanity can carry their legacy forward." The door to the observation deck opened, and a delegation of human diplomats entered, followed by representatives from 6 different alien species who had come to join the conference. Among them was Keth Voran, the former High Admiral who had once commanded the fleet that nearly destroyed humanity. He had surrendered himself to human custody after the war, expecting to be executed for his crimes, and had been shocked when the human court sentenced him to something far worse. They sentenced him to help rebuild what he had destroyed, to spend the rest of his long life working to undo the damage he had caused. Every day, he woke up and faced the species he had tried to exterminate, and every day he had to earn their trust through action rather than words. It was a punishment more painful than any death, and he was grateful for it. Ambassador Okonkwo, one of the human diplomats, called out, "The conference is about to begin. Everyone is waiting for your opening remarks." Yara took a deep breath and looked at the crystal in her hand one more time before tucking it safely into her pocket. She walked toward the delegation, falling into step beside Keth Voran, who nodded to her with respect that had taken months to become genuine. "Ready to make history?" she asked him. "I am ready to try to deserve the mercy you showed me," he replied. And there was no pride or arrogance left in his voice. Only the humility of someone who had seen the worst of himself and chosen to become better. They entered the main conference hall together, human and former enemy walking side by side toward a future that neither of them could have imagined. The hall was filled with beings of every shape and size, representing species that had spent centuries fighting each other over territory and resources and ancient grudges that no one could even remember anymore. But today, they sat together in peace, united by the revelation that they were all children of the same cosmic gardeners. Yara walked to the podium at the center of the hall, feeling the eyes of the galaxy watching her with a mixture of hope and fear and curiosity. She thought about the words she had prepared, the carefully crafted speech that her advisors had spent weeks perfecting. Then she threw it all away and spoke from her heart instead. "1 year ago, humanity was dying," she began, her voice steady and clear. "We had lost our war, lost our fleet, lost almost everything that mattered. We were alone and afraid and certain that tomorrow would never come. So we did something desperate. We reached into the darkness and called for help, not knowing if anything would answer, not knowing if what answered would be friend or enemy. We took a chance because that is what humans do. We hope even when hope seems foolish. We fight even when victory seems impossible. We believe in tomorrow even when today is trying to kill us." She paused and looked around the hall at all the different faces watching her. "The Ancient Ones answered our call, and they saved us," she continued. "But they did not stay. They gave us knowledge and guidance. And then they returned to their realm beyond the stars. They did this because they believe in us. They believe that we are ready to stand on our own. They believe that we can become worthy of the legacy they left behind. Now we must prove them right, not just humanity, but all of us, every species in this hall, every world that circles every sun in this vast and beautiful galaxy. We have a choice to make. We can go back to the old ways, fighting and conquering and destroying each other until nothing is left. Or we can choose something better. We can choose to be the gardeners the progenitors hoped we would become. We can choose to protect and nurture the young species who are just beginning their journey toward the stars. We can choose to build instead of destroy, to heal instead of wound, to love instead of hate." She raised her hand and opened it to reveal the crystal that Elias had given her, its light filling the hall with warmth. "The progenitors have given us the locations of 17 worlds where new life is growing," she announced. 17 chances to get it right. 17 opportunities to prove that their faith in us was not misplaced. I am asking all of you to join humanity in this mission, not as followers, but as partners, not as subjects, but as equals. Together, we can create something that will last for billions of years. Together, we can become worthy of the name they gave us, inheritors. The hall erupted in applause and cheers. Species that had been enemies yesterday standing together today with tears in their eyes and hope in their hearts. Yara smiled and felt the weight on her shoulders become lighter, shared now among countless others who wanted the same future she did. The war had been lost, but humanity's story was just beginning. And somewhere beyond the stars, in a realm where time and space had no meaning, the Ancient Ones watched their children take their first steps toward becoming something magnificent. They had waited 3 billion years for this moment. They could wait a little longer to see how the story would end.